Hello there, welcome to the channel, welcome to Nerd.World History. Today I'm going to be looking at another obscure tank, as I like to look at obscure and kind of forgotten military vehicles, and I've done a lot of it with tanks, and we are looking at, and I'm sorry if I butcher the pronunciation, the Salinas tank from Mexico. A country that I've never really associated with tank production, apparently for a good reason. They don't build them. But here's one they did build. Way back in the First World War, they built the Salinas tank. Before we get started, just want to mention my sponsor, Relentless Rebels, who recently sent me this rather nice wolf's bite bracelet, which is actually pretty cool. It's made of stainless steel. It's kind of chain-like, very fun. And I honestly would say, if it wasn't any good, if it was like turning my skin green or something, and it's not been doing, I've been wearing it a bit. If you're interested in Viking style jewelry or anything else of that nature, there is a link in the description below. Click on that and use the code NERD20, all in capitals, at checkout to receive a 20% discount on any purchase. With that said, moving on, the Salinas tank of Mexico, circa the First World War. The history of this tank is a little interesting and a little all over the place. Mexico was not involved in the First World War, as we know. Their contribution to it was nothing. Mexico was involved in its own internal domestic conflict in being embroiled in a civil war, which started in 1913, which is a part of history that is its own story, so we're not going to focus too much on that. At some point, the Mexicans decided they'd never been a big producer of domestic homegrown weapons and technology. They'd always relied on imports. They decided at this point they were going to begin developing their own technology and weapons at home. That led to the development of their homegrown tank program. A tank program that was clearly inspired by what was being developed by the Allies on the Western Front, as can be seen by the tank's basic rhomboid design, which is very similar to the British tanks of the Mark I through to the Mark IV series used during the First World War, although quite what the Mexicans wanted these tanks for is a little vague. They wouldn't necessarily fit with the style of warfare that the Mexicans were utilizing. In that civil war, Mexico is a country of very different environments to Western Europe. To its north, it's got great plains and deserts. To its south, it's got dense jungles. The favoured styles of warfare in these two environments is not trench warfare. Now, the British rhomboid design tank was specifically designed to cross trenches. The tank's primitive technology, low speed, and not great range doesn't lend itself well to the modern concept of armoured mobility, or even a few decades later concepts of mobile infantry tanks. So the tank's exact use is actually unknown. What exactly genuinely what the Mexicans were thinking of using this tank for is unknown. The Salinas tank was only produced, as a single demonstrable model, a single unit. There may have been others produced, it's simply been lost, but as far as we can tell, there was only one prototype ever built, which again strongly resembled the British Mark I tank. Now, as I said, there was a culture and environment developing in Mexico that was strongly supporting domestically produced and developed weapons as well as technological innovations during war. Around this time, several different government institutions were combined together to form the TNCA, which I'm not going to try and pronounce in Spanish because I genuinely cannot pronounce what that actually stands for, but it translates as the National Aircraft Construction Factories, and they were the ones who would go on to produce the TNCA Salinas, or Tanca Salinas. The vehicle was likely designed by Major Alberto Salinas Carranza, and I'm sorry, I might be mispronouncing that man's name, but he's the most likely person to have designed the tank, although again a little vague, as records are not great. After all, Mexico was embroiled in the Civil War at the time. People weren't often writing too much down. Not let's survive. We don't know. He probably was the name, position in the military. He probably was the vehicle's designer. But getting back to the design, it was clearly strongly inspired by the British Mark I. Now, exactly how the Mexicans managed to get their hands on the designs for this tank, whether there was some under-table dealing, whether they stole them, as I say, bought them, captured one somehow, or got one of the Germans or the Russians who both managed to capture them during the war, we don't know. But somehow they did. The vehicle had mounted in the nose what was a French-built autocannon, a very powerful weapon actually, which we'll get to in a second, as well as, like the British tank, it had a sponson on either side of it that, rather than being kind of blocky like the British version, was actually more curved and a bit, in my opinion, slightly more aesthetically pleasing, each one containing a machine gun. The vehicle again had a crew of about 8 to 12 potentially, much like its British contemporary, and generally was very eerily reminiscent of the British tank, including its tank tracks, for example, that are, as I said, a rhomboid shape with the tracks that run right around the tank's hull, which is iconic of First World War tanks that didn't have the sort of protected tracks of vehicles which have now. Now, on to that main gun. The main gun was a Hotchkiss 37mm revolving cannon made up of 5 barrels. Now, if you actually go off what were the documents, it actually states that it was a 47mm revolving cannon, but this is believed to be a typo from what research I can find. Probably someone misstruck a 4 instead of a 3, as there is no mention ever of there being produced a 47mm variant of the Hotchkiss revolving gun. This was basically a gigantic Gatling cannon which could unleash a hail of death upon whoever was in front of it. It had good armor penetration, was a really excellent weapon, very powerful and far stronger than the kind of machine guns being carried on British-French tanks during the First World War. There is some possibly apocryphal references to a 75mm gun being tested, but it probably wasn't. This may have just been, we think it could take the 75mm gun, but there's no actual direct evidence that this weapon was ever actually tested in the tank. There's no pictures or anything else, but it probably was something they were pondering, whether or not they should or could use such a large heavy caliber weapon in such a vehicle back then. But again, we then get back to what exactly the Mexicans were planning to use this tank for. As I said, they didn't use trench warfare. These things could only move similar to the British tank, because they had a fairly similar power plant. They probably were 3 to 5 miles per hour, 5 on a good day on a flat surface on a road. They didn't have much range. The tracks that need replacing fairly quickly, as rubber wasn't exactly something widely used back then, I'm not even sure it had been invented. The tracks were all steel riveted together. They would basically, with the vibrations of the tank, they would shake themselves apart. That was one of the problems the British tanks had. Modern tracks obviously have overcome this problem, but back then tracks would wear themselves up pretty quick, or at least would require maintenance to sort of hammer them back together because they'd begin to vibrate themselves apart. So again, what were the Mexicans planning to use this tank for? I don't even think they knew. I think they heard of this new weapon, this wonder weapon from the trenches, from the Western Front, and they wanted it. They built their own version, probably based on acquired designs somehow, or maybe a British vehicle that they managed to get their hands on somehow, and they built their own reverse engineered version. And they explored whether or not this vehicle could be used by the Mexican army and came to the conclusion that no, it couldn't. The vehicle never went into widespread production, wasn't widely utilized, or anything else. Did it actually see any service? No, probably not. So I don't really think they had a plan. I think they were exploring the idea of a tank, but they probably wanted the kind of tanks that had been being produced in the 20s and 30s, but they wanted them back in 1917 when this thing was being produced, and it's simply the technology hadn't been developed yet. They wanted a tactical use vehicle before the technology had a chance to catch up with it. So that's the Salinas tank in brief. Of course, there is a great deal more about this vehicle that you can find out online, but it's just elaborations on what I've just said. And it would require going into more detail of the Mexican Civil War, which I'm not doing here, but it is a fascinating look at a fascinating vehicle by a nation that's not, again, typically known for the production of armoured vehicles. And it's interesting to find out that they didn't actually produce one. And I only learned about it when doing research for another tank video I'd done in the First World War, and I kind of found a link that took me to this. And I thought, I didn't even know Mexico had ever produced a tank. And lo and behold, the Salinas. And again, I may be pronouncing Salinas wrong. Feel free to correct me. I'm not Spanish, I'm not Mexican. Who knows if I'm saying it right or wrong. With all that said, please like, share, subscribe, and comment down below. And don't forget to check out my sponsor, Relentless Rebels, if you have an interest in old type Viking jewelry. And use the promo code NERD20 for a discount. That's it. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.